Good morning this Monday. Until 2017, for about 10 years I think, up until 2017, I ran a website I had created called askamechanic.info, and it had a lot of my articles and photos on it and all that kind of thing. And it got to the point to, well, actually the website crashed because I didn't keep my Joomla updated, which was kind of dumb. But anyway, I wasn't going to go back to the trouble to rebuild that and try to recover all that material because it just wasn't, it was just too much trouble. But for a while, I would have people email me and ask me questions about certain car problems. Now, I didn't have all the answers, nobody does, but occasionally, whenever I would give somebody an answer that would work, they would reply and tell me that what I had told them helped. And that was very gratifying, whenever you give somebody some information that gets them going again. Sometimes the professional mechanics will, well, like for example, one time I was in another state and I was teaching some Border Patrol mechanics about electronic diesels. I had a class up there, stood behind a podium that said Homeland Security and all that. And the Border Patrol mechanics would install the lights and the radios and all that kind of thing in these new SUVs. Well, they were using GM SUVs at the time, and I was talking to the guy that was in charge of all these Border Patrol mechanics, and he said that something had gone wrong. The ABS light was on or something, I can't remember what it was, and so he sent it to the dealer because it was brand new and it was still under warranty. And so the mechanic worked on it for something like 2 days trying to figure out what was wrong with it, and then he found out that whoever was putting the radio in had pulled the fuse that fed a part of the ABS system, and so they were going to charge the Border Patrol $1,700 for that guy replacing that fuse. In other words, they wanted to recover all the wasted time, the money for all the time he had wasted before he finally got around to checking the fuses. And I don't know how that situation played out in the end, but I told that Border Patrol mechanic supervisor, I said, you do not owe that GM dealership $1,700. Now that guy should have checked the fuses before he did anything else. Well, it's just the way it is. A lot of the times the simplest answer and the cheapest answer is the smartest answer. And you can overthink something and go way off on a tangent and get into territory that, cost you a lot of time and money. This one here is from somebody named Stacy. Didn't tell me what kind of car it was. She said it runs weird sometimes, floor and accelerator won't go but 25 miles an hour. Somebody told her it was the fuel injectors or the pump or the filter. That's not bad information, but she said she revved it in park, it would drive fine for a bit and then it would happen again. I said, that sounds like it's starving for fuel to me. Get the fuel pressure checked, which would I do if I had an install service bay. Remove the filter and blow back through it into a cup. That's what I used to do. I'd get a plastic cup. Can't use styrofoam cup with it because it won't hold gas. It'll go right through it. Plastic cup, like one of your big drink cups from Hardee's or whatever. That's the hard plastic. Blow backwards through that filter and you'll see the crud that comes out of it. You also can tell how restricted it is that way. And I said, if it's easy to blow through the filter, the pump might be weak. Well, that's almost never a problem with the pump. Her follow-up was, thanks, it worked. And apparently she did that. There was this gal down there that was a waitress when I used to eat at the steakhouse, and she said something about her Volkswagen Rabbit wouldn't run good. And I knew she tinkered with it a little bit herself on the weekend. She just told me that, and I said, why don't you pull the fuel filter off and replace it, because it sounds like you're starving for fuel. So showed her where it was and how to get it off of there, and she pulled it off and blew a bunch of air through it or whatever, and cleaned it out, put it back on. It ran a whole lot better. She didn't have the money to replace it. I thought that was kind of funny. But now Robert had this Windstar. Clicking sound when the heater's on, no cabin heat. Is this something I can fix? And I said, actuators make that noise when they try to move the door and it won't move. This happens on just about any car that's got those plastic gears like that. Remove the actuators and try to move the doors by hand. That's what mechanics do. They'll pull the actuator off and they'll grab the little door and they'll try to see if it'll move. If it moves freely by hand, the actuator is the only problem. If the actuators got stripped gears like the one you see in this picture here, and you don't figure out, sometimes they just strip and wear out because, they sort of lose their calibration and try to keep closing the door when it's already closed, and that's why they need to find the open and closed place whenever they recalibrate. But anyway, I says if you can't move that door freely by hand, the plenum's going to have to come over there and somebody's going to have to replace those doors. And he says, oh, well, you were right on with the diagnosis. They don't give you a lot of information on the follow-up usually. This one guy, I gave him a bunch of instructions and he replied, hey, works great, thanks. But anyway, this one here said it. He did what I told him to do. This one that you're seeing in this picture here is one that I had. That's my hand there. If you've seen it enough, you probably recognize my hand. But anyway, I always like to take these apart. And that little worm gear turns that gear, and it's almost like a clock. They gear it up to the point to where it, this actually was connected to the door and all that. So, but anyway, this would turn that, and that would turn this. No, excuse me, this was meshed to this, that's meshed to that, and that turned the door. You can see how they geared it down. Now, those plastic gears can only take so much, Anyway, this one here says 90s GMC Suburban suddenly won't shift out of first gear. All the fluids are fine. Now, what I'm going to told him sounds silly, and I said the PCM either doesn't know the vehicle's moving or there's something inoperative in the shift circuit. I'd put a scan tool on it and see if it had a vehicle speed signals, what I'd do. Because if it doesn't know it's moving, it won't shift out of first. That's the primary input right there. Have somebody retrieve the trouble codes, write them down, then remove the battery cables for about 10 minutes. Put it back on. That reboots everything and see if that makes a difference. See, this didn't cost anything to do, and if it didn't fix it, he would be no worse off. That is one of my chief criteria for anything, whether I'm working on it or whether I'm telling somebody else about it. His follow-up was, thanks for your help. It was right on point, And I had one student that there was a bunch of gauge stuff on some GM vehicle that he had, and he basically looked up the technical service bulletins, and they said tell it to reflash the cluster on that one there. And he said that the guy that he was working for said that every mechanic that had worked on the one of them before him replaced the cluster. And he fixed it without replacing the cluster, and that guy was just really impressed with that. But he found it in a technical service bulletin, was other guys should have been reading, you see. Alright, let me see. This one here was interesting. When I'm in gear or not, my engine sputters when the gas pedal is lightly pressed. He's basically got a misfire whenever he's... The first time I ever saw this was on a Ford Windstar. And I could crack the throttle right there in the service bay, just crack the throttle and it would start misfiring. And I was thrown by the fact that the injector would quit clicking shortly after it started misfiring. That's because the PCM was shutting the injector down because it was misfiring on that cylinder, which was number 4 on that 3.8. And I said, well, and I knew this because one of my students had his mother's Nissan, just like this one, 2.4, had a funky skip and a surge, and me and him rode it down the road. I unplugged the EGR valve and it smoothed out. And I said, so unplug the EGR valve and see what that does. So he unplugged the EGR valve and it ran 100% better. He said it picked up a bunch of horsepower. And he says, I'm strapped for cash. How long do I have until I can pay somebody to clean those ports out? He really didn't need to pay anybody to clean the ports out. They're not hard to clean, because this is the manifold from that particular engine. Now, this little adapter plate goes here. The EGR bolts to that. But these are the little, you take these little plugs out, you can clean those ports. That's what the little plugs are there for. But when one of those ports winds up being the only one that's open, then it's gonna, what you're gonna have is you're gonna have all the EGR going through that one port, and the other ones aren't going to be getting any EGR. And every cylinder is supposed to get the same amount of EGR. But see, that was feeding into here, and all of those are supposed to get the same amount. Anyway, I'd run into that before on a Windstar, and when I saw it on that 2.4 that was my student's mother's vehicle, this guy just happened to be talking about the same problem, and he had a misfire code, which will throw you if you're not careful too. This one here says 2003 Explorer, 96,000 miles, bucking in reverse only. He backed up about 120 feet. I ran into that on my 95 Taurus. I was on the interstate, missed my exit, stopped almost immediately, got on the side, out of the traffic, and was backing up to get to the exit. Or maybe I was backing up coming off of the exit. I can't remember, but I was in a kind of a hurry, and I noticed that the engine was, like going into rev limiter mode, but I wasn't revving it that high, but I was trying to drive about 30 or 35 miles an hour backwards. It wouldn't do it. My buddy that was working at the Ford place, his wife had a Taurus that was the same year as mine, and he noticed it doing that, and he was in the transmission part of the shop at the time, and he pulled his transmission apart under warranty looking for a problem, but it turned out it was programmed into the engine controller for it to do that. Now, the reason they did that, back in 1995, I think it was, Audi had a bunch of cars that would take off in reverse and crash and hurt people and cause a lot of damage, and it was blamed on the car. But in every single one of those cases, it was driver error. And what they were doing was, in those days, you didn't have to put your foot on the brake to put it in gear. And they put their foot on the gas, they would put it in reverse. It was already at past idle because it was cold. And it would start to accelerate going backwards, and it would throw their foot against the gas pedal, and they couldn't get off of it until the car hit something. This can also happen even on one that's got a stuck throttle plate. This one lady that had been backing out of the same driveway every day for years and years and years, I read about. I don't remember where this happened at. She somehow managed to back her Explorer out of the driveway across the road into the pond, and it sunk and she drowned. And nobody could seem to figure out why she did that. But I was saying, that throttle body likes to stick. I've seen them do that. And if she put it in reverse, even if she put her foot on the brake to put it in reverse, and then she put her foot on the gas, and initially started trying to give it the gas, and it was like standing on something hard, and then all of a sudden it pops loose, it would have done exactly the same thing those Audis were doing. There was nothing wrong with the car. It was driver error. And that's why nowadays on every car you have to put your foot on the brake before you put it in gear. That's where that came from. And a lot of the Jeep Cherokees, we actually had to go in there and put a different shift cable on them to retrofit that for that reason. Because the Jeep Cherokees would, didn't have it where you had to put your foot on the brake. Now, everybody didn't do recalls like that. But for some reason, Jeep decided to do it, and we had to replace a ton of them shift cables on those late 90s Jeep Cherokees because of the problem they had with those Audis, and I think the Jeeps must have been giving it sometimes too. One guy came in there with his Jeep one time and said that the engine tried to run away with him, and he switched it off and he wasn't going to drive it anymore until somebody did something about that because he didn't want to crash and burn and die. And so they brought it, nobody touched it, they brought it in on the rollback, they let it off of the vehicle, and I walked out there before I did anything else. I looked in there shined my flashlight down to the floorboard, and the gas pedal was stuck under the floor mat. He had pushed the floor mat, it was some cheap floor mat that he had put in there, and it had wrinkled up, and it made a place where the accelerator pedal would stick. And that's, a lot of the times people will blame it on the vehicle when all they have to do is look down there and see what's going on. See, it wasn't the fault of the vehicle that time either, but people want to blame it on the vehicle, and that's happened. But anyway, this guy said, well, I was going to have my transmission rebuilt, but no, I don't think I need to. And this one here is humming noise. When he accelerates or decelerates, here's a humming noise, sounds like the tires. And put it in neutral the next time, slow to a stop. I told him to take it, switch the engine off and see if it still made the noise too. He did that, and I said I wouldn't worry too much about it, just pay attention. If it starts getting worse, it's probably the tires anyway. So he drove it and swerved left and right and heard the noise change sound, changed the tires around, and it changed the properties of the noise. So basically he just had to gather enough data to where he understood. But I will tell you this, if somebody has got some of these front wheel drive cars, if somebody drives one too long without rotating the tires, even if all the alignment is just like it's supposed to be, those back tires, because of the alignment specs and the way they're set up, it seems like I ran into this on a Honda specifically. This woman said she was one of the instructors at the college. She called. She said, "I just had my tires rotated, and now the tires sound like I'm driving a tractor down the road." And so she said it wasn't doing that before the tires were rotated. Well, there was a strange little wear pattern that's just natural that happens if you go too long without rotating the tires on one of those cars. And if they're not the only, Hondas aren't the only ones that'll do it. It's really important on a front-wheel drive car to regularly rotate the tires. And if you wait too long, you may wind up with tires that are so noisy you can't stand to drive it. The way we fixed that Honda car was we put the tires back like they were. And anyway, they says he was wondering, if two different direction tires can make the noise, blah blah, So anyway, that was the tire thing, and so he figured out just by the way that he followed through. Sunshine had this 2002 Rodeo, whoever Sunshine is. When the lights are on, the brake pedal's pushed, the rear lights will go out except the top middle brake light. The lights are on, cruise control won't work. Cruise button on the dash lights up, but you can't set the speed. When the cruise is on, all the brake lights except the top middle brake light won't work sometimes. Well, here's the deal on that. What most people don't know about cruise control, and I've seen a lot of people that didn't know this, is what this controller is looking at, whether it's the PCM or whatever, is it's looking at this ground. All right, let me draw that. It's looking, I'm going to draw it green. It's looking at this ground that's coming through the bulb to there. Okay, so what happens to that ground whenever you apply the brake? When you apply the brake, that ground goes away, right? And when the ground goes away, that's how the controller knows you applied the brake. The controller on cruise control for a long time, and on the ones I've been associated with, doesn't care about voltage. It's not looking for that. It's looking for the ground coming through these bulbs. And that's why she had lost both of her stop lamp bulbs, except her high mount stop lamp bulb, and it did not have enough current drawing. It didn't draw enough current to completely supply this ground to the, in other words, the ground that was coming through the high mount stoplight wasn't enough to satisfy this thing that the brake wasn't applied. And but I learned that both when I was installing cruise controls, when I was working on cruise control systems, that you can take both of the stoplight bulbs out, and if the high mount stoplight something like an LED or whatever like that, you're not going to have any cruise control at all. There was a vehicle that came into the Ford place that this guy was working on. He didn't know a whole lot. He always liked to just do injector flushes and all that and try to turn a lot of hours, but he couldn't fix a ham sandwich, with all due respect. And I was looking at this Ford Focus he was working on, and he said, "I can't get the cruise to work. I've replaced all the, the switch and the module, just throwing parts at it." And so I got the test light, hooked it to hot, went to the light that goes to the brake lights. It should light up really bright. That test light's pulling 1/4 of an amp. Those those stoplight bulbs pull about 2.5 amps each. And so I said, all right, now I'm going to hold this down here so I did not see anything except a very, very faint ground at that light. And I said, let's go to this other car where the cruise is working and check this same wire. And when we did, it lit the test light really bright. I said, now let's walk back to the back and see what we see. We went back to the back and it had LED stop lights and tail lights that they had put on there that dressed the thing up. Now there is a way nowadays, I showed you this whenever I converted my F-150 to LED lights. You can actually put a resistor on there. They make resistors for this that you hook between the circuit going to the light and ground that will increase that. That was not available back then when I was helping that guy. And he was talking about doing something like that. And I said, we don't need to be modifying anything related to cruise control, airbags, or anything like that, or ABS, Need to basically put it back like it was. Anyway. Well, Dave had this 96 Dodge Dakota that he pulled the transmission out of and put it back in. It wouldn't start after that. And I said, maybe you pinched the crank sensor wires, left them unplugged. He said, well, I pulled the crank sensor last night, and when I inserted the sensor, it picked up a star washer. Now these kind of sensors here, you can't tell it there, but this is an adjustable sensor. And when you put it in there, this little paper spacer is supposed to be against the teeth on that wheel. And that sets the gap between this and this. And whenever the first time you started, it skins that spacer off of there. And you can actually buy these little spacers in a box, like when you're putting the crank sensor back in. This is on Dodge and Jeep, that kind of thing, on the V8s and V6s. But anyway, that's what that sensor looked like. But this magnet on the end of this thing had picked up a star washer. But we had one, and before I knew about this little thing here, I noticed this is a slotted hole, and if you adjust this thing too close, it doesn't run right. If it's too far away, it doesn't run right. It's got to be just right. So that's an adjustable sensor, and that little paper spacer on the end of it is what sets the gap like it's supposed to be. Now Kim had this 92 Crown Victoria that wouldn't idle. This wasn't very hard to fix. The idle air control valve is stuck. Typically, I've told a bunch of people, whenever they'd say, hey, my Ford, Explorer or whatever, won't idle, and I said, go, replace the idle air control valve, see what that does, because it doesn't cost that much, and it fixes it just about every time. Well, this next slide, I've got a video where I literally show you what's going on in this circumstance. She replaced the idle air control valve on the Crown Victoria and it fixed it. And I've seen that a whole bunch of times. That's a real common failure. But this is what I want to show you on this. This 99 van, 6.8 liter V10, has a start and die problem. You start it up, it goes dead. Start it up, it goes dead. We're going to go down here, we're going to have a look, and we're going to see what's wrong. Okay. I pulled this hose out of the way so we can look into the inside of the idle air control, and when we start it, that little plunger should move. It doesn't. It sticks, and a lot of the time these do that. Now, what I can do, give me a screwdriver, Brandon. What I can do is I can unstick this, and it won't do that. Now, there is a little problem with the fact that I've got a big air leak, but that little hose ought to be doing that. I need a long screwdriver there. And I'm going to reach in there, and I'm going to do what I can to break this loose, and so that it'll move. Aha, see? I moved it a little bit because it was stuck. Now, however, it still died because we've got our mass airflow into it. When we plug this back in so that the air is being channeled through mass airflow, it's confused. Because the mass airflow is not measuring the air that's going in through this hose. But these idle air controls have a tendency to fail. This is what it looks like. Okay. Well, that finishes us up for today, and I really appreciate you guys watching, and I hope you get a lot of good information out of this, or at least have fun watching it. I'll see you guys next week.